born July 11, 1920, in Baku, Russia, and was the son of Isaac and Zecharia Sitchin. Soon after his birth, his family moved to Palestine, where he grew up and questioned his formal education. He learned a variety of Near Eastern languages, including Hebrew and Sumerian. He moved to England for college and attended the London School of Economics and the University of London, from which he graduated with a degree in economics in 1941. It was also in 1941 when he married Rena Ragenbaum, and the two would eventually be together for the next 66 years, raising two daughters, Edna and Ella. After graduation from the University of London, he returned to Palestine, where he became a journalist and also served in the British Army till 1944. From 1944 to 1949, he was assistant town clerk of the Tel Aviv municipality. He served as secretary-director of the economic department of the Tel Aviv-Jaffa Chamber of Commerce from 1949 to 1952. And during his time back in Israel, he also served in the Israeli army from 1948 to 1949. In 1952, he moved to New York, where he continued his journalism career. From 1953 to 1964, he also served as the executive director of American Israel Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and he was the president of the America-Israel Pavilion at the New York's World Fair from 1964 to 1965. In 1967, he began working with the Intercontinental Trail Sea Corporation, which was a foreign trade service based in New York and London, England. While Zecharia Sitchin led a somewhat interesting life up to this point, it would be his endeavors throughout the next 40 years that would propel him to greatness. With that said, it would be an event when he was 9 years of age that would serve as the catalyst for that greatness. Here's how he explains it. I was a schoolboy privileged to study the Bible in its original language, Hebrew. We reached the story of the great flood in the book of Genesis, where it stated that it was at that time that the Nephilim were upon the earth. I raised my hand and pointed out that word literally meant those who have descended, who have come down from the heavens to earth. For that, instead of being complimented, I was reprimanded. You don't question the Bible, the teacher roared. I can still feel the hurting. It caused me to become persistent in looking for the answer to the enigma of the Nephilim. To whom was the Bible referring? And why does the next verse in Genesis refer to them as sons, plural, and as gods, plural? An aberration in a Bible devoted to monotheism. A clue in a 19th century commentary led me to seek the answer in the mythologies of the ancient peoples. There has been the many gods. From Greece, I traced them back across the Mediterranean Sea to the ancient Near East. The myths of the Egyptians and Assyrians, Babylonians and Hittites and Canaanites seem to tell the same tales, only calling the same pantheons by different names. In the end, I discovered that all those myths, and thus the enigmatic verses in the Bible about the Nephilim, had a common earlier source. Tales of gods and men first written down on clay tablets by a people called Sumerians. In the 1970s, Mr. Sitchin's lifelong interest in the archaeology of the Middle East culminated in a book, The 12th Planet, published in 1976. As Mr. Sitchin recounted, he had studied and studied, traveled and traveled, and talked, until one day his wife Rena said, "Isn't it time, Zecharia, that you stop talking about this subject and start writing?" Mr. Sitchin went on to explain that when he began work on the 12th Planet, he thought it would be his only book. But as we now know, he ended up writing a total of 15. The 12th Planet appeared at the height of the ancient astronaut controversy that had been generated by claims of Erich von Däniken that he had discovered evidence of the presence of UFOs and extraterrestrials in the artifacts from various ancient cultures. While von Däniken may get much of the credit for originating the ancient astronaut theory with his book Chariots of the Gods, it was not really his theory. Some scholars argue that in the works of Helena Blavatsky we find the first modern version of the ancient astronaut theory. Blavatsky postulated the possibility of life on other worlds and that the ancients were already aware of the advanced extraterrestrial creatures. She argued that these creatures had visited the Earth and aided the evolution of humanity. Indeed, several decades before von Daniken wrote his book in 1968, the premise of the theory had been formed by several researchers and writers. Von Daniken's approach was, however, somewhat novel in that it centered upon pictures from ancient sites that could be seen as resembling contemporary astronauts and objects similar to items reported as unidentified flying objects. Mr. Sitchin started with a somewhat different hypothesis, that ancient mythology should be read as historical documents, as reports of actual occurrences. As we mentioned earlier, his starting point was the biblical book of Genesis, chapter 6, and the cryptic references to the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, and the giants or Nephilim who were on earth in the era prior to the biblical flood. Using a variety of ancient documents, including the Babylonian epic known as the Enuma Elish, he hypothesized the existence of another planet in our solar system, which he named Nibiru, that travels an elliptical orbit that brings it into the area between the orbits of Jupiter and Mars every 3,600 years. The planet is inhabited by a humanoid race called the Anunnaki, who created Homo sapiens. So, in other words, Zecharia Sitchin relied on actual historical text and references to formulate his hypothesis. The Anunnaki paradigm, or the Sitchin paradigm if you will, draws from references that were discovered only about 170 years ago and later. And while his research irritates academics and religious folks alike, it does not necessarily refute either, which is ironic when you consider that his most vocal critics are members of those two camps. The Anunnaki paradigm fits easily into Earth's deep history and actually leaves room for everything else without contradiction. In this way, it is a true unified theory. Mr. Sitchin's timeline based on the Enuma Elish goes something like this. The solar system formed about 4.6 billion years ago with its original 10 members. The Sun, known as Absu, Mercury, which is Mumu, Mars, which is Lamu, Venus, which is Lahamu, Jupiter, which is Kishar, Saturn, which is Anshar, Pluto, which is Gaga, Neptune, which was Ea or Enki, Uranus, which was Anu, and Tiamat. Sometime between 4.6 and 4 billion years ago, a possible rogue planet entered the Sol system. The Sumerians called it Nibiru, and the Akkadians later named it Marduk during his reign. The Sumerian cosmogony describes a battle between Tiamat and Nibiru. Its entrance into the solar system was counterclockwise and opposite of the orbital motion of the planets. Neptune and Uranus exerted the first gravitational effects on Nibiru, but the rogue planet was able to escape. And during the process, it lost and gained several satellite moons. As it penetrated deeper into the solar system, it was attracted by the gravitational pulls of Saturn and Jupiter, which caused an orbital relocation and put Nibiru on a collision course with Tiamat and its satellites. Up to this point, Nibiru had attracted 7 satellites and Tiamat had a host of 11, with Kingu as the largest, nearly the size of a small planet. As Tiamat and Nibiru approached each other, their moons collided with one another, causing a catastrophic event on Tiamat and splitting her in two. The smaller half of Tiamat retained Kingu and hurtled into its new orbit. The other half of Tiamat fragmented into millions of pieces and formed the asteroid belt. On the way back out of the inner solar system, Nibiru gave Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto new orbits. So let's think about this. In this interpretation of the Enuma Elish, we can still have the solar system created about 4.6 billion years ago and the Earth somewhere between 4.5 to 4 billion years ago. That has zero conflict with the current scientific paradigm. But the religious folks are a different story. In truth, the majority of so-called religious people might say, yeah, I get those numbers. But a certain number will argue that because we are quoting something not in their Bibles, it cannot be correct. That is complete and utter nonsense, and the archive will not waste precious time in a counter-argument with such imbeciles. Getting back to this collision theory, we find that the latest theories in the scientific community are inching closer and closer to a complete validation of Mr. Sitchin's interpretation of the ancient Enuma Elish. Just about 1 year ago, in July 2019, a new study by a team of researchers from Rice University suggests that a planet smacked into Earth 4.5 billion years ago, leaving behind elements that not only shaped our world, but also us. Their research, which appeared in the January 2019 issue of Science Advances, holds that Earth's status as the only known life-sustaining planet came about because another planet that carried carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and other elements just happened to be passing through our neighborhood and had an accident. Essentially, they are suggesting that if not for this collision, Earth might have remained an uninhabitable wasteland. In just this one study, we not only find credibility in Mr. Sitchin's interpretations, but we also see the concept of panspermia demonstrated. The idea that a giant planet is lurking beyond Neptune is an idea that astronomers have speculated for the last century. However, the hunt for this planet turned much more serious in 2012 when Scott Shepard, an astronomer at Carnegie Science, and his team found a far-flung object that was truly unique. It was an object called VP-113, and it currently holds the record for the most distant object orbiting the Sun. The closest it ever gets to the star is 80 AUs, or 80 times the Earth-Sun distance. Shepard noticed that this object also followed a path similar to those of a few other distant space rocks, as well as a far-off dwarf planet called Sedna. They all have this clustering, and so that suggested that something was pushing them into similar types of orbits. Then, in 2016, a pair of researchers from Caltech, Mike Brown and Konstantin Batygin, did the math. Based on the orbits of 6 of these objects, they estimated that there's a planet roughly 10 times the mass of Earth orbiting far beyond Neptune. Their calculations showed that it possibly takes 10,000 to 20,000 years to orbit the Sun. Brown and Batygin dubbed the phantom planet Planet 9, though others had been calling it Planet X for years. Since 2016, the search for an additional planet has become more and more refined. And regardless of whether its name is Planet X, Planet 9, or Nibiru, the undeniable reality is that the bleeding edge of scientific discovery in the field of astrophysics certainly believes in the possibility of its existence. Moving along in Mr. Sitchin's timeline, we see that roughly 4 billion years pass before the Anunnaki show up on the scene about 450,000 years ago. That immense time period holds endless possibilities for all types of evolutions and transformations of the planet. Regardless of whether life naturally formed on Earth or was the result of a collision with an intruder planet, 4 billion years is enough time for hundreds of civilizations to have evolved, thrived, and disappeared without a trace. In essence, Mr. Sitchin's timeline accounts for all those possibilities of biological and cultural evolutions on Earth. And it was also his contention that the same evolutions could have very well and likely did occur on Nibiru. If the argument of the existence of an intruder planet that entered our solar system and caused havoc in our orbital dynamics serves as the first major component of the Anunnaki paradigm, The second most important component is the actions of Anunnaki after arriving on Earth, namely the manipulation of Homo erectus DNA and thus the creation of modern humans. In a nutshell, after studying, translating, and interpreting hundreds if not thousands of ancient texts, seals, inscriptions, artifacts, and architectural structures, Mr. Sitchin determined that the Anunnaki first arrived on Earth about 450,000 years ago, and that their arrival was motivated by the problem of an eroding atmosphere. They established a large gold mining operation in South Africa, and gold was shipped to Mesopotamia, where the spaceport was set up to transport it to Nibiru. The Anunnaki manipulated the DNA of Homo erectus already on the planet and created humans to work the mines, then later intermarried with their creation. The near approach of Nibiru around 11,000 BCE led to the destructive flood recounted in Genesis. Noah and his family escaped in a submersible ship. After the flood, life began again with the Anunnaki's assistance. As we are primarily focused on Zecharia Sitchin and his 100th birthday, the archive finds it prudent to refrain from outlining the amazingly complex details of the two primary components mentioned here. But fortunately, the archive has a wealth of reference materials on these subjects and much more. The following presentations are recommended for those viewers who are interested in a deep dive into this subject matter. In Nibiru Truth Parts 1 and 2, the archive goes into an incredibly detailed discussion regarding the existence of Nibiru and the criticisms of its existence. The Anunnaki timeline provides Zecharia Sitchin's actual delineation of Anunnaki-related events on Earth starting from the beginning. Anunnaki gods of ancient India, Egypt, Greece, and Mesoamerica provide an intricate comparative analysis on how these ancient cultures are actually the continuation of the Anunnaki story on Earth. Anunnaki Gold delves into the subject of the Anunnaki mining, refinement, and transport of Earth's gold to Nibiru. Evidence of the Anunnaki and Anunnaki genetic engineering of humans provide an in-depth analysis of the actual DNA manipulation of our ancestors and the modern scientific validations of such manipulation. Nibiru in ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform and Anunnaki in ancient Mesopotamian text are two presentations which focus solely on the ancient Mesopotamian source material regarding these two words and their many meanings. Enki vs. Enlil is a multi-part series highlighting the constant conflict between these two brothers from Nibiru and the effects those conflicts had on ancient Earth history. The Lost Book of Enki Synopsis is a series that covers what many consider Zecharia Sitchin's greatest work. We also encourage you to review some of our direct reference videos, such as the Book of Enoch, the Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, and the Descent of Inanna. Links to all these presentations are provided in the description below this video. As we close out this special presentation in honor of Mr. Sitchin's 100th birthday, the archive declares its enormous respect and debt of gratitude to a man that has forever changed how humanity should view its origins and, for that matter, its future development. We could have spent hours talking about Mr. Sitchin's personal history and biography, but chose instead to focus on his lifetime of research, findings, and interpretations. Indeed, there will be many presentations and tributes coming up commemorating his death on October 9th this year. But the archive decided to focus on his coming into this world, not his passing from it. We celebrate his birth and not his death, because in many ways Sitchin never died. The truth he uncovered is eternal regardless of its non-acceptance in the currently flawed academic and religious paradigms of our day. Each day that passes sees more validation of his work versus negation thereof. One of Sitchin's most ardent supporters may have said it best. Anyone who says Zecharia Sitchin is a fraud or mistaken in his translations of Sumerian text or anything in that vein is busily grinding a heavily worn axe. They base all their complaints on the fact that in certain key areas of the Sumerian writings, he deviates markedly from the classical translations, the vast majority of which were completed before 1947, before the terms UFO or alien came into common usage. When the early translators came upon passages that could have been and should have been interpreted the way Mr. Sitchin interpreted them, they had no conceivable frame of reference for such terminology. Thus, they shoehorned it to fit into their own restricted worldviews, and because this nonsense was created by experts of that time, modern experts are inevitably brainwashed by their education process to believe no other translation is needed, much less preferable. This intellectual claptrap has become established as the preferred and accepted translations that critics claim Mr. Sitchin should have respected and stuck with in the way they are obligated to do. Mr. Sitchin rightly jettisoned the nonsense and translated the text more like they were actually written, calling an alien, so to speak, and this gross offense to modern academic sensibilities is what classic scholars consider a sacrilege to their mindset. I have no doubt that, in the fullness of time, historians will consider Zecharia Sitchin vastly more correct than any mainstream pundit alive at this moment. Why? Because modern scholars endure years of intense training that forces them to consider the work of prior scholars sacrosanct, which produces a virtual army of close-minded sycophants who ultimately will be dismissed as laughably wrong. The archive has endeavored to continue Mr. Sitchin's legacy because in the end, we believe that is exactly what he wanted.
I think that the information that comes to us from the past is information that should be used first in the form that I wrote it, but secondly, and no less importantly, to be used from like a stepping stone to say, okay, if Sitchin is right, if there is another planet, if we have been visited, if that is how we were created, what does it mean for our social organization, our religions, our scientific knowledge? In other words, I would like to see more of what is already happening, that my books are being used as textbooks by others who teach and research in their own fields, and sort of I brought it to here and they take it from there into their specialties. And that is, I think, would be the ultimate benefit of my writings.